You think you're ready for the spirit? Don't embarrass yourself, Captain. The jeers cut through the war room, harsh and mocking. Elara Storm Kane didn't rise to it. She simply dragged her hand across the map, tracing a flight path so reckless the laughter stopped cold. Hours later, missile alarms screamed, engines roared as the B-2 Spirit of Solara tore across hostile skies. One bomber alone! Explosions ripped the horizon as 9 enemy bases vanished in fire. The same generals who mocked her now stood frozen, jaws open in disbelief. What happens when instinct and innovation crush every rule of tradition? This is Veteranbiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. You think you're ready for the spirit. Don't embarrass yourself, Captain. The words crack like a ruler on a desk, sharp, dismissive, meant to sting. Laughter ripples along the oval table, uniforms tipping back in their chairs, coffee cups trembling against saucers. Screens bloom with satellite feeds and threat rings. The air tastes of recycled air conditioning and arrogance. Elara Storm Kane doesn't take the bait. She steadies her breath, lets the noise pass over her like wind across a wing, and slides a fingertip to the edge of the illuminated map. She doesn't argue. She draws. A thin blue line unfurls across the projection from the Western Sea approach, then spears inland, threading valleys, skipping radar lobes, skirting the jagged petals of surface-to-air coverage. The jeering thins, not because anyone is convinced, but because the sound of certainty falters when confronted with geometry. She tightens the curve near a mountain spine, then taps a cluster of coordinates that updates the predicted detection window. The algorithm gives a number. The number is small. No one laughs. General Aldrich Mercer, Iron Fang to those who fear him and to those who pretend they don't. Folds his arms as if he could crush an idea just by holding still. "Neat drawing, Captain," he says, voice raw granite. War is not a chalkboard. His eyes flick to Colonel Damien Cross, the decorated B-2 driver at his right shoulder. Cross keeps his face neutral, which in rooms like this counts as agreement. Elara's hand stays on the glass. "Sir," she says, tone calm enough to lower the room's temperature, "this isn't neat. It's necessary. Traditional ingress along the southern corridor guarantees illumination by overlapping search radars. We stop being a shadow and become a target. Terrain masking buys us time. Time buys us surprise. You sound like a manual," someone mutters. "Manuals don't do this," she replies, and with 2 quick gestures she layers wind vectors over topography. The ribbon of her route bending, hardening, slipping into the earth's folds like ink down a crease. A second ribbon appears, what the doctrine book would choose. Its arc walks bright into an amber ring. The room doesn't laugh this time. Mercer's jaw pulses. "We'll hear from Colonel Cross," he says. "He has flown this aircraft for longer than you've worn that rank. Recommend we stay with established corridors, cross-offers, measured, less unknowns. Margin for error exists for a reason. Unknowns, margin, words meant as anchors deployed as anchors." Elara looks at the wall of screens, not the men. The threat rings bloom and breathe like jellyfish. Patterns hide inside patterns. She thinks of her grandfather's voice at a kitchen table covered in paper maps, his fingers, replotting a route by lantern when the generator failed. "Trust the line you can prove." She inhales and speaks. "Margin for error shrinks when the enemy builds to it," she says. "They're counting on our caution. We give them caution. We give them time. We erase surprise. We write our obituary. It's not heat that changes a room. It's vacuum." The space after her words lacks oxygen. The operations chief clears his throat and tries to refill the gap with jargon. Mercer lifts a palm, silencing him. "Captain," the general says, "we are not here to audition courage. We are here to measure survival." "Exactly," Elara answers. She doesn't raise her voice. She turns the map 40 degrees, and the picture changes. Valleys become corridors. Radar fields that look like solid plates fracture into lattices. A new seam appears in the defense net, not obvious until the terrain is seen from this angle, this tilt. The line she drew lands there, thin as a whisper, stubborn as a vow. A young intel officer at the back forgets to hide his curiosity. He steps closer to the display, checking the clutter of numbers like he's afraid to be seen reading a forbidden book. "Sir," he says before he can stop himself, "the captain's corridor intersects. A blind sector generated by the mountain's northwest face. It's tight, but real." Mercer doesn't turn. "Return to your station, Lieutenant." The lieutenant swallows and obeys, but the word real hangs in the air like a candle you can't blow out. Cross shifts. He's not threatened. He's experienced. He knows when math is talking. "Suppose you thread it," Mercer says at last. "Suppose you're impossible to see. You still have to strike targets spread across a region without tripping a hornet's nest. We do not get second chances." Elara lets go of the glass. The map keeps shining. "We don't need second chances," she says. "We need the first one to count." Silence. The kind you get when many men consider a single woman and try to decide if what they're hearing is audacity or comprehension. She's not out to win an argument. She's out to survive a mission that doesn't forgive ego. Her heart isn't loud. It's steady. She thinks of desert dawns, of charting by horizon and memory when instruments lied, or slept, of counting seconds in her head until the numbers felt like bone. Mercer pivots to the logistics table. "Window? Hours," the ops chief says, gaze pinned to the feed. "Their northern batteries come online by nightfall. Once they overlap, penetration options reduce to near zero. Near zero. An invitation if you believe in zero differently than other people do." Mercer studies Elara the way a surgeon studies a blade before deciding if it will cut true. "You have an answer for everything," he says. "No, sir," she replies. "I have an answer for this." He doesn't like the sentence because it leaves him two roads. Deny a plan because it's not his, or accept a plan because it works. Power hates binary. He tries to wring nuance from fate. "Colonel Cross will launch on the eastern profile," he says, reaching for compromise. "Captain Kane can continue analysis." Elara doesn't look at Cross. She looks at the projection's eastern curve and already knows where it breaks. She shouldn't speak again. She does, anyway. "Sir, the eastern profile assumes a temperature gradient that doesn't exist anymore. Their radar is already compensating. Flying into it will light us up like a parade." The word parade is a fracture. It lets the truth cut. A murmur slants across the table. The ops chief, to his credit, runs a fast simulation with updated atmospherics, numbers strobe. The eastern path glows a color no one wants to see. Mercer's face barely moves. Years of command settle on him in a visible weight. He doesn't apologize, generals don't. He doesn't bluster. Cornered pride learns to be quiet. He turns the weight into a sentence and sets it in front of her like an anvil. "If you fail," he says, "we lose more than an aircraft." "Yes, sir." "And if you succeed," he continues, eyes like iron filings under a magnet, "you'll have done what your seniors insisted could not be done. That has a cost, too." She knows what he means. Success is another kind of threat. It rearranges rooms. It asks institutions to look in a mirror. She nods once. Understood. There is a permission in the nod, and there is also a boundary. She will not bend the route to flatter anyone's comfort. Mercer feels the line and accepts the only thing left: risk. He points at the map like he's pointing at the edge of the known world. Then draw the rest, he says. She does. The blue thread becomes a lattice of timing marks, release points, pace to. The aircraft's breath turns keyed to terrain shadows and not to doctrine. She layers decoy vectors that will trick algorithms conditioned to expect symmetry. She signs the sky with asymmetry. The room changes again, not awe, not yet. But concentration replaces contempt, which is the first step toward respect. Cross leans forward, studying. He doesn't fight the math now. He is a professional, and professionals recognize clean work even when it comes from the wrong mouth. Spirit of Solara, Mercer says, eyes still on the map. If we do this, we use the ship with the best skin. His voice is all decision, no decoration. Brief in 30, wheels up at first light. The dismissal is not dramatic. No fist on table, no shouted order. Just a release of air like a jetway door opening. Chairs scrape. Papers slide into folders. The young lieutenant glances at Elara with a look he will later call gratitude, and now calls nothing. Cross pauses near her, lowers his voice and says, without condescension, watch the crosswinds near Ridge 17. They do a little dance. Noted, she answers, and for a blink they are simply two pilots looking at the same sky. When the room empties, the war map dims, but doesn't go dark. She stays a moment longer, alone with the path she drew. Quiet returns, real quiet. The kind that belongs to people who are about to stake their lives on a line through air. She lifts her hand, not to steady it, but to feel the hum of the projector through glass. She will not carry the noise with her. She will carry the line. Outside, the runway lies in hard daylight. Mechanics walk ant-small between hangars, hands full of tasks that look like rituals because they are. Far down the apron, a stealth bomber sleeps like a slice of night misplaced in noon. The name painted under its cockpit says Solara. She will step into it soon, turn noise into motion, and see if the sky keeps its promises. Back inside, she pockets the room's last sound, the sentence that began this day, and lets it become fuel, not fire. She does not rehearse replies she'll never deliver. She has a checklist to write, a sequence to memorize, a margin to widen through thought. Innovation isn't rebellion for her, it's responsibility. If there's a seam in the net, she'll find it and fly through without touching a thread. The door clicks shut behind her. The corridor smells like jet fuel and chalk dust. Down the hall, a clock counts toward the brief that will fix the path in more minds than hers. She doesn't look at it. She looks at her hands, opens them, closes them, as if calibrating the instruments that matter most. Then she walks toward the light, toward the hangar, toward the black. Wing that will make or break the argument she refused to have. The laughter is gone. The line remains. And for a pilot who knows the difference, that is enough. The briefing room emptied, yet Elara lingered at the edge of the glowing display, her fingertips resting on the cold metal of the console as if to steady the line she had traced. Outside, the sun beat down on the tarmac, but her mind drifted to another sun, one that had burned above desert sands long before this mission. Memory has a way of surfacing when pressure is highest, and hers carried her back to Nevada, to mornings when the sky was endless, and her world was just a battered aircraft and the voice of a man who never spoke softly. Her grandfather, Elara Storm Kane, was no ordinary teacher. Retired from the Air Force with a chest of medals he rarely mentioned, he still carried the weight of Cold War skies in his bones. To the world, he was a relic of an older generation of aviators. To her, he was the man who had turned flying from a skill into a language. He would take her into the desert with nothing but a compass, a star chart, and a Cessna whose paint flaked like dried riverbeds. There, away from radar and technology, he pressed into her the truth that sky navigation was more than instruments. It was about learning the rhythm of wind against terrain, the subtle tilt of constellations, and the way silence itself could guide you if you learned to listen. She could still hear him on those late nights when the desert cooled, machines fail, batteries die, satellites are blinded. But stars don't lie. They've outlived empires and will outlive us. A true pilot carries the sky in their head. At the time, she was too young to understand how those lessons would matter in war. Back then, she thought it was just an eccentric old man teaching her tricks that belonged to another century. Only later did she realize he had been giving her something rarer, confidence in her ability to think beyond systems. That upbringing had set her apart from the start. In the university classrooms where equations ruled, she excelled not because she memorized faster, but because she questioned why the numbers worked. Professors saw a student who connected theory with instinct. Peers saw someone who never seemed rattled even when calculations slipped into chaos. When she chose to join the Air Force, it wasn't rebellion or family legacy, it was inevitability. The desert had carved the decision into her long before she signed her papers. At training, she faced the same doubts that clung to her now. Instructors muttered that her mind was too analytical, that she'd overthink under fire. Yet when exercises through simulated disasters, systems blackout, misaligned targeting, sudden electronic attack, she thrived. Others panicked when their displays vanished. She shifted to mental math and celestial cues, recalling nights, counting seconds beneath open sky. And she proved again and again that she could improvise where manuals left silence. All that history echoed in her as she stepped out of the planning chamber and into the corridor of Fort Halcyon. Fluorescent lights hummed above her, sterile and unyielding, nothing like the desert moonlight she had once studied. But even here, surrounded by concrete and protocol, she carried those memories like instruments no one could confiscate. A security officer saluted as she passed. His eyes flickered with something between respect and disbelief. Word had already spread of the confrontation inside. She answered the salute with measured calm. Not triumph, not defiance, just steady composure. Every whisper behind her only confirmed what she already knew. When tradition feels threatened, rumor becomes armor. She let them talk. The operations wing smelled faintly of jet fuel drifting in from the hangar. Screens buzzed with new intelligence. Enemy convoys resupplying forward defenses reinforced. Bunkers being sealed. Mobile launchers rolling into camouflaged alcoves. The 9 bases weren't simply outposts. They were knots tying an entire region together, binding resources, shipping lanes, and communications into one web. Cut a single strand, the rest held. Cut them all in sequence, the network collapsed. That was the nightmare. Each fortress supported the others, overlapping fields of defense, covering weaknesses, anticipating conventional strikes. Elara studied the images and saw her grandfather's maps again. To others, the enemy architecture looked impenetrable. To her, it looked like a puzzle designed by people who assumed opponents would think only one way. They had armored themselves against predictability. Against surprise, they were still naked. She carried her notes to the smaller analysis room where junior officers worked in shifts. The same lieutenant who had spoken up during the briefing sat hunched over data streams, his jaw tense. When he noticed her, he straightened quickly, uncertain whether to apologize or remain silent. She spared him the decision. "You saw it," she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am." His voice cracked. "The northwest blind spot is real. Most wouldn't risk it, but it's there." Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "The difference between most and one is history." The lieutenant swallowed and nodded, as though he'd just been handed a responsibility heavier than rank. Later, alone, she returned to her quarters. She didn't rest. She sat at the desk, spreading charts the way her grandfather had spread his across the kitchen table. She traced possible countermeasures the enemy might deploy once the first strike landed. If she miscalculated, they'd close ranks after one base, maybe two. She needed every step plotted like choreography, the approach, the angles, the egress routes. Failure wasn't an option, not because of her pride, but because every soldier on the ground, every ship at sea in the region depended on her gamble. The clock on the wall ticked louder than she liked. She looked at her hands. They weren't trembling. They never did when the weight grew heaviest. But she flexed them anyway, remembering her grandfather's words. "Pilots don't fly with hands, they fly with judgment. The hands only follow." Her thoughts drifted briefly to Mercer, Iron Fang, the immovable wall of tradition. She could imagine what he saw when he looked at her. Youth, audacity, a resume too thin for the stakes. And maybe he was right by conventional logic. But war didn't always honor conventions. It rewarded those who bent them without breaking. She wasn't blind to the danger. She just refused to let fear masquerade as wisdom. A sudden knock broke the silence. Colonel Cross stepped in without waiting for invitation. His expression remained professional, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too many missions go wrong. "I don't like this," he admitted. "You don't have to," she answered, folding the map. Cross studied her, then spoke lower. "It isn't about whether I like it. It's about whether you're ready to fly a machine that doesn't forgive mistakes. The B-2 isn't a fighter. It's patience wrapped in steel. Treat it like a falcon and it'll bury you." She met his stare. "Then I won't treat it like a falcon. I'll treat it like a weapon designed to end wars before they start." Cross didn't reply at first. He searched her face for bravado, for cracks, for any sign she was bluffing herself. He found none. At last he nodded. "Watch Ridge 17. Winds sheer there. They'll try to trick you into rising above the terrain. Don't." When he left, she exhaled slowly, not because she was relieved, but because even dissent carried truth worth carrying. Every warning, every caution, she would turn into calibration. Night drew closer outside the windows, though she barely noticed. The mission countdown pressed forward. Soon she would step into the hangar where the spirit of Solara waited. Soon she would exchange blueprints and theory for silence and sky. For now, she traced her grandfather's old compass with her thumb. It was dented, the needle sluggish, but it had guided her through storms where electronics drowned. She slipped it into her flight bag, not because she expected to need it, but because reminders matter. In the stillness, her reflection stared back from the darkened glass. Not a novice, not a prodigy, just a pilot with one chance to prove that survival sometimes belongs to those willing to see the sky differently. And outside, 9 fortresses waited, unaware that a single shadow had already begun to draw its path toward them. The sun had barely risen over Fort Halcyon when the War Council reconvened. The glass-paneled room on the top floor overlooked the runway, where the dark outline of the spirit of Solara seemed to absorb the dawn itself. The aircraft waited like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, as if everyone sensed that the decisions made here would shape More than one mission, they would test the very doctrine that had governed their service for decades. General Aldrich Mercer stood at the head of the table, posture rigid, his silver hair clipped to regulation perfection. Around him sat a mix of colonels, strategists and systems officers, each with tablets glowing in muted colors. The intelligence feed scrolled lines of data across the wall-sized screen, troop movements, radar frequencies, intercept vectors. Yet, none of it carried the same electricity as the unspoken argument still simmering beneath the surface. Colonel Damian Cross, tall and controlled, leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. His reputation carried weight in this room, years of experience in stealth, operations, dozens of sorties that had ended without incident. To Mercer, he embodied reliability, the very quality that the general insisted could not be compromised. Elara entered last, her uniform immaculate, expression composed. She carried a folder under one arm, not for show, but because she intended to challenge assumptions once again. Every eye followed her as she took her seat, though the silence was broken almost immediately by Mercer. "We'll speak plainly," he began. His voice filled the chamber like gravel poured into steel. "The targets are fixed, the enemy is tightening its grip, and the clock is moving faster than we like. Colonel Cross will fly the profile. Captain Kane will remain in tactical support. That is the path of prudence." No one dared interrupt him, except her. "Sir," Elara said, sliding the folder open, a holographic projection flickered to life above the table, casting light across the faces of those who leaned closer despite themselves. "Prudence is a false friend when the enemy knows exactly how we think. This is their trap." Mercer's jaw hardened. "Captain, you've made your argument. Tradition exists because it works." She rotated the holographic terrain model with a flick of her hand. Peaks and valleys shifted, radar cones expanded and shrank. With precise gestures, she drew a simulated path, Cross's recommended approach. The projection lit up crimson where overlapping coverage zones painted the bomber in hostile color. "Colonel Cross's flight plan is sound only if the enemy has failed to adapt," she explained, voice steady. "But they've adapted. Atmospheric layers have shifted since the last profile was tested. Their radar isn't static, it's learning." Cross bristled, though he kept his tone measured. "You're saying every calculation my team and I have run is worthless?" "I'm saying," she replied, "that your calculations are accurate for a world that no longer exists." The words cracked the atmosphere like a whip. Officers who had been staring at their screens now glanced between the two pilots. Mercer raised his palm, intending to restore order, but Elara pressed forward before he could speak. "Look at this corridor," she said, drawing her own route through the model. "Terrain masking here, turbulence here. It's narrow, but it threads the blind spots they don't believe anyone would dare to use. It's high risk, but the only path that offers genuine invisibility." Mercer's voice was iron. "You're describing a maneuver better suited to a daredevil than a strategist." Cross's method keeps options open. Elara locked eyes with him. "Options vanish the moment their senses wake up. Sir, caution will kill us faster than risk." The room went silent. One of the younger analysts, unable to contain himself, spoke up. "She's right. The Eastern Corridor assumes gradients that aren't there anymore. The simulations are off." He quickly fell silent when Mercer's gaze cut toward him, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Cross leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "Captain Kane, experience isn't an obstacle, it's what keeps pilots alive. You may think innovation saves missions, but machines like the B-2 demand discipline above all." Her answer came swiftly, but without venom. Discipline without imagination is predictability, and predictability is exactly what those 9 fortresses are built to exploit. The table seemed to tilt, half the room drawn toward her audacity, the other half recoiling from it. The weight of hierarchy clashed with the clarity of numbers. Mercer's knuckles tightened against the table's edge. "Enough," he said, though the word lacked its usual finality. "This isn't about ego. It's about survival." Elara's voice cut through the thick air. "Survival isn't served by clinging to what worked yesterday. We're fighting tomorrow's war, and tomorrow punishes hesitation." A hush descended once more. The model above the table displayed both paths side by side, the conventional arc glowing. Red with vulnerabilities, her unorthodox line glowing blue, narrow but alive. It was no longer a matter of who spoke louder. The evidence glared in every officer's eyes. Mercer turned deliberately to Cross. "Colonel?" Cross hesitated, and in that hesitation the balance shifted. His experience told him her analysis was not reckless bluster but the product of a different lens, one forged outside the confines of old playbooks. Still, pride fought inside him. He finally spoke with restraint. "If she's wrong, the mission ends in fire before it begins. And if she's right," Mercer countered quietly, "we achieve the impossible." No one expected him to say it. For the first time, the general's certainty cracked, revealing not weakness but the recognition of stakes too great to ignore. He looked across the table at Elara, his voice now heavy with the burden of command. "You understand what you're asking for," he said. "Yes, sir," she answered. "I'm asking for the chance to succeed where tradition guarantees failure." The general's eyes narrowed, weighing not just her words, but the unwavering calm with which she delivered them. Around the table, the air felt like a storm about to break. Everyone knew history was being written in the pause before his verdict. Finally, Mercer exhaled a sound like metal under strain. "Very well. You get your chance, Captain. But mark my words, if you fall short, no one will remember the argument you won here, only the disaster you caused." Elara inclined her head. Not a smile, not triumph, just acknowledgement of the weight now placed squarely on her shoulders. The meeting dissolved in uneasy murmurs. Some officers avoided her gaze, unwilling to endorse what they feared. Others glanced with a spark of something approaching respect, and Colonel Cross, though silent, offered a small nod, not of approval, but of recognition that she had forced even him to see differently. As she left the room, the corridors buzzed with rumor. To many, she was still the untested pilot challenging the hierarchy. To herself, she was simply walking toward the aircraft that would either prove her right or silence her forever. Beyond the windows, the black wings of the spirit of Solara stretched across the tarmac, waiting. And for the first time, the fortress network beyond the horizon no longer looked invincible. It looked vulnerable because one woman had dared to redraw the sky. The corridors of Fort Halcyon pulsed with movement as word of the general's reluctant approval spread like electricity. Officers hurried between offices, technicians rushed to prepare systems, and whispers rode the air vents as if the building itself carried gossip. Elara Storm Kane walked steadily through the chaos, the echo of her boots the only constant in a swirl of anxious energy. She was not immune to the magnitude of what had just happened. She simply refused to let it overwhelm her face. In the command center, screens streamed with live satellite imagery. 9 enemy strongholds glared back in clusters of red, each bastion tied to the other by overlapping arcs of defense. Together they looked less like bases and more like a steel net laid across the region. Breaking one strand meant little. Breaking all at once meant survival. The analysts around the screens whispered about probabilities, but none dared say aloud what was on everyone's mind. The clock was already running out. An operations officer intercepted Mercer with a report clenched in his fist. "General, surveillance drones confirm rapid fortification. Mobile launchers are dispersing. By dusk, their lattice is airtight." Mercer read the lines with a face that betrayed nothing. "Then dusk is our deadline." He turned to Elara, who had just entered. "You wanted the impossible? The window is closing by the hour. If you mean to prove us wrong, Captain, you'll have to do it today." For a second, time froze. Around the room, pens stopped moving, eyes darted toward her, breaths caught. The decision had been swift, merciless, and final. There would be no weeks of rehearsal, no long nights of simulation, only now. Elara's reply was measured, her voice firm enough to cut through the tension. "Then I'll fly today." The words struck harder than any announcement Mercer could have made. Officers who moments ago dismissed her as audacious now saw resolve that bordered on unshakable. Even Colonel Cross, still wary, shifted in his seat, conceding through silence that she had accepted a challenge no one else dared. Minutes later, the base roared to life. Hangar doors rumbled open. Ground crews rolled fuel lines and weapons carts toward the black silhouette waiting on the apron. The spirit of Solara gleamed under a pale sun, its skin absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. To the untrained eye, it seemed inert, almost fragile, but everyone here knew it was a blade honed to pierce the thickest armor. Elara walked the length of the bomber, fingers grazing its edge as though feeling for imperfections. Every rivet, every seam was inspected by her gaze, not because she doubted the crew, but because she needed to absorb its reality. This was no longer theory or argument. This was the steel she would entrust with her life. Her crew chief, a broad-shouldered sergeant with grease under his fingernails, approached. All systems checked. Fuel tanks topped, payload primed. "She's yours, ma'am." "Thank you, Sergeant." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, we've never seen anyone fight for this jet the way you just did. Bring her back in one piece." She nodded, a silent promise more binding than any oath. As final preparations unfolded, Mercer and his circle of advisors stood on the observation deck. His arms were still crossed, but his eyes never left the black triangle that dominated the tarmac. To him, it was not merely an aircraft, but a wager, a gamble that innovation could succeed where decades of orthodoxy insisted otherwise. The mission briefing was quick, stripped of ceremony. Coordinates, timing, fail-safes, contingencies, all delivered with the efficiency of men and women who knew the stakes too well to indulge in speeches. Elara listened, memorizing every line, but she also traced her own notes in the margin, corrections, refinements, instinctive adjustments only she could see. Finally, Mercer spoke, his gravel voice carrying through the hangar. "Captain Kane, understand this. If you fall short, we lose more than a bomber. The network will stand, and every soldier depending on this strike will pay the price. If you succeed—" He stopped himself, unwilling to offer hope too openly. "Then you'll have changed everything." She met his gaze, unwavering. "I understand, sir." The crew dispersed, leaving her with the bomber. She climbed the ladder into the cockpit, the confined space humming with silent power. Screens blinked to life, switches glowed faintly under her hands. She adjusted her seat, fastened harness straps, and set her helmet beside her knee. The canopy closed with a heavy thud, sealing her inside. For a moment, the outside world vanished. The noise of the hangar, the eyes of skeptics, even the faint shuffle of Mercer's boots on the observation deck. Here it was only her, the machine, and the endless sky waiting beyond. She began her pre-flight checks with practiced rhythm, each command a pulse in her mind. Hydraulics, nominal. Fuel pressure, green. Avionics, calibrated. Her voice was calm, almost ritualistic. Yet beneath it, her thoughts stretched beyond the checklist. She pictured the enemy grid tightening, the countdown to dusk ticking faster than any clock. She imagined her grandfather at the desert airfield, nodding once as if to remind her, precision is not about numbers, it is about trust in the line you draw. On the tarmac, ground crews cleared. Engines spooled to life, the roar deep yet muted by stealth design. The bomber shuddered, then steadied, a beast awakening. Lights flicked across the runway, signaling clearance. "Spirit One, this is Control," came the voice in her headset. "You are authorized for immediate departure. Execute Operation Nightfall." Nightfall, the code name hastily assigned. To Elara, it carried more than strategy. It was a promise. If she failed, darkness would descend not only on her, but on everyone relying on her flight. She eased the throttle forward. The bomber rolled, accelerating smoothly, tires rattling against concrete seams. At rotation speed, she pulled back, and the spirit of Solara lifted into the air, cutting free from Earth with the grace of a shadow. Inside the control tower, Mercer watched as the jet vanished into the horizon. A shape swallowed by daylight until it could no longer be seen. His officers murmured about telemetry and signal strength, but his gaze remained locked on the sky. For the first time in decades, he felt uncertainty. Not about the mission, but about the boundaries of what could be achieved when someone refused to be bound by tradition. At altitude, Elara adjusted her course, aligning with the path she had defended before the council. Clouds drifted below, mountains rose like jagged teeth, and the horizon stretched infinite. Her pulse steadied, her breathing matched the rhythm of the engines. She was alone now, utterly and completely, and that solitude felt less like isolation than like destiny. She whispered to herself, not as comfort but as confirmation. 9 fortresses, 1 chance. Behind her, Fort Halcyon receded into silence. Ahead, the enemy waited, confident in defenses no one dared challenge. But they had not planned for her. They had not accounted for the pilot who saw the sky differently, who turned ridicule into fuel, and who now carried the weight of a mission history would remember long after the laughter had died. And as the spirit of Solara cut deeper into hostile air, the world shifted toward a reckoning only she could deliver. The spirit of Solara climbed smoothly, its matte black wings merging with the sky until it became more silhouette than aircraft. Elara sat enclosed in the cockpit, surrounded by a subdued glow of instruments. Every display told her the bomber was alive yet obedient, waiting for her guidance. The hum of the engines reverberated through her seat like a steady heartbeat. She inhaled once, sharply, steadying herself, then reached across the panel to engage the full suite of stealth systems. With a sequence of deliberate movements, she vanished from the eyes of the world. Below her stretched an ocean of ridges and plains, cut by thin silver threads of rivers and the faint glint of highways. It should have looked peaceful. But in every valley and behind every horizon, Elara knew, were sensors ready to detect and annihilate anything foolish enough to breach the perimeter. She was no longer flying practice profiles across Nevada. She was trespassing into the teeth of a defense grid designed specifically to expose her craft. She recalled Mercer's gravel-toned warning that failure would mean not just personal ruin but regional collapse. It pressed against her thoughts, heavy, but she would not let it invade her rhythm. Instead, she leaned on something older, the instinct to translate maps into motion, numbers into survival. Every second ahead would be calculated, but every calculation would require improvisation. The radio crackled softly. Spirit 1, control, confirm, climb complete. Her voice was clipped, professional. Climb complete, course set. From here forward, no one could hold her hand. The line she had drawn was hers alone to follow. As she pressed deeper into the hostile zone, she initiated her mental checklist. The payload remained secured, release systems primed, and the terrain avoidance radar mapped the Earth in ghostly sweeps. She glanced at the console where star positions aligned with her navigation model. Redundant by design but comfortingly familiar. It reminded her of nights under desert skies, where the compass in her pocket and her grandfather's lessons had meant more than electronics. Here, in this cockpit, those memories became more than nostalgia. They became survival. Cloud banks formed ahead, dark and towering. She knew their edges would offer temporary cover, but also turbulence. Many pilots hated punching through weather in bombers this size, but she welcomed the distraction it would give her. Radar beams struggled with storm clutter, and in those gaps she could slip closer to the grid without a trace. She shifted throttle, angled the nose, and the bomber sank into the grey belly of the storm. Rain streaked across the canopy, vanishing instantly against the heat. Inside, the cockpit lights blinked softly, unaffected by nature's assault. She felt the aircraft buck under gusts, but her hands remained steady on the controls. It wasn't bravado, it was necessity. Panic had no place here. The storm broke, and sunlight spilled across her instruments again. Ahead, the first markers of enemy territory flickered on her screen, faint electronic pulses scanning in intervals. Elara's eyes narrowed. These were not stationary radars, but mobile arrays, shifting position to trap intruders. If she had followed the path the colonels favored, she would already be visible. Instead, her chosen route kept her tucked behind a mountain range that shielded her from their sweep. Still, she could feel the danger growing, like a drumbeat under her skin. She ran the sequence again in her head. Entry, first strike, reposition, second strike. The 9 strongholds were not aligned in convenience. They had been spread deliberately to demand attrition from anyone daring to strike them all. That design had scared others away. For Elara, it was simply a puzzle waiting for its answer. Spirit 1, telemetry clean, came the distant voice of control. She responded with a single word: copy. She didn't need them filling the silence. The fewer distractions, the sharper her mind became. Her gaze fell to the mission clock. Time slipped faster than she liked. The enemy was reinforcing with each passing minute. She eased the bomber lower, hugging the contours of the land. Terrain masking was never comfortable in a jet this size. It demanded faith that the systems wouldn't betray her and that her reactions would be fast enough to save the rest. Yet she welcomed the closeness of the ground. It was her shield. The first objective now loomed on her map. A command hub buried within hills, but still dependent on surface antennas. The strike had to be flawless. If she failed, the other 8 bases would immediately know the attack had begun. She checked her armament system, fingers moving smoothly across the panel. Payload armed, guidance linked, trajectory locked. Her throat tightened, but not from fear, from clarity. This was why she was here, not to argue in rooms of brass and medals, but to act when action mattered. Target 1 in range, she whispered to herself. She shifted altitude slightly, aligning the bomber with the valley entrance. At this distance, even the smallest mistake would expose her. She nudged the yoke, correcting for unexpected wind shear rolling off the ridgeline. Her breath slowed. The release cue blinked. She pressed the control. A low thud reverberated through the fuselage as the first precision weapon detached and vanished beneath the bomber's belly. The system tracked its arc silently. Elara didn't watch the impact feed. She watched the terrain, already maneuvering into position for egress. Seconds later, the screen confirmed what she already felt, a silent bloom underground. The command hub erased in an instant. Her hand flicked switches, readying for the next approach. The clock in her helmet display counted forward, relentless. She banked hard, rolling into another valley, knowing the second and third. Targets were arranged deliberately to draw her into exposed air. She would not oblige them. Instead, she blended altitude changes with angles they wouldn't predict. Using every lesson drilled into her by storms, sand, and skepticism, the bomber slid between peaks unseen, unheard, but deadly. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only focus. Ahead lay 8 more fortresses, each harder than the last, but for now she had drawn first blood, and in the silence of the cockpit, with nothing but the hum of the spirit of Solara around her, Elara Storm Kane allowed herself a single thought: this is only the beginning. The valley ahead narrowed into a jagged funnel of rock, a natural corridor carved by centuries of wind. For Elara, it was both refuge and trap. Hugging close to the terrain masked her bomber from high-angle sensors, but it also left her little space to maneuver if the unexpected appeared. She steadied her breathing, eyes moving rapidly between instruments and the horizon. Every flicker on her display mattered. Every faint return of radar static could mean discovery. She banked slightly, pulling the spirit of Solara into the shadow of a ridge. The aircraft responded with obedient grace, heavy yet precise, its stealth skin drinking in the light of the sun. Somewhere on the other side of those mountains, enemy operators were scanning for her. Confident their overlapping systems could catch anything bold enough to intrude. They didn't know she was already here. Her second target lay embedded beneath the ground, a hardened communications array linking the entire defense network. Antennas disguised as harmless towers sprouted above the surface, but beneath was a buried bunker directing signals to the other fortresses. Taking it out meant silencing the coordination that gave the 9 bases their collective strength. Elara reached for the navigation console, toggling away from the main path. A shortcut through open sky would be faster but suicidal. She chose instead to weave deeper into the folds of terrain. The bomber shuddered slightly in turbulence, but she trusted the line. It had always been about the line. Find the seam others ignored, then hold it until it carried you through. Her display chimed softly, release zone approaching. She armed the payload, set trajectory adjustments, and counted down in her head. The silence inside the cockpit deepened, broken only by the quiet hum of electronics. At 0, she pressed the control. The weapon detached, vanishing beneath her into invisible arcs. Elara immediately altered course, banking hard to the left. She skimmed just above treetops, vanishing from the angle most sensors expected her to take. Seconds later, the feed confirmed the strike. A bloom of static across the comms net, followed by silence. The bunker had collapsed inward, cutting off the array before anyone could broadcast a warning. 2 down, she murmured under her breath. But she didn't allow pride. Pride was distraction. And distraction in this sky was death. The third installation was only minutes away, a missile battery tucked along a plateau, its launchers hidden under camouflaged shelters. It was designed to spring open and fire with almost no warning. To approach directly would mean triggering an automatic response. She had to outthink not just the operators, but the machines themselves. Her eyes tracked the stars chart faintly overlaid on her display, a backup system she had coded herself. The radar sweeping the airspace relied on predictable approaches. She would come from the angle least expected, using a shallow dive through a weather front forming at the edge of her path. Clouds would scatter radar, but more importantly, they would hide her altitude shift. She dipped the nose of the bomber, engines throttling just enough to carry momentum into the descent. Wind buffeted the airframe, rattling loose items in the cockpit. She held firm, hands steady, as the plateau loomed closer. Her targeting computer beeped insistently, warning of active sensors ahead. She ignored it. She trusted her calculation. Then, a sliver of light, the camouflaged hatches opening, missile launchers rising. They had sensed something, but too late. Elara released her weapon, then yanked the bomber into a brutal climb, pressing herself into the seat with crushing force. The weapon found its mark, erupting into fire that consumed the battery before the missiles could clear their tubes. The plateau blossomed with flame and smoke. She crested the climb, steadied the aircraft, and exhaled once through clenched teeth. 3 fortresses erased. 6 remained. For the first time, enemy chatter crackled faintly across the scrambled frequencies she monitored. They knew something was happening, even if they didn't know what. Radar sweeps intensified, painting the sky more aggressively. It would only get harder from here, but as she leveled the bomber and charted her next course, Elara allowed herself one thought of defiance. They had expected caution. Instead, they had found her, and the battle for the skies had only begun. The radio frequencies erupted with noise, snippets of commands, frantic voices, bursts of coded signals. The enemy was stirring. Elara tightened her grip on the yoke, knowing stealth alone would not carry her much further. They were awake now, desperate to seal the holes she had already torn into their defenses. Warning lights blinked as her sensors detected a sudden spike of activity. Surface-to-air missile batteries were locking onto patches of sky, casting invisible nets to snare whatever intruder had dared to break the perimeter. She adjusted course, hugging the land again, but the grids overlapped with ruthless precision. The machine's voice whispered in her headset, "Trajectory unsafe, abort recommended." She silenced the alert. Automation had been trained to value survival above risk, but survival here depended on boldness. With a flick of her wrist, she disengaged autopilot entirely, forcing the bomber into manual control. The spirit of Solara responded like a beast unchained, its weight immense, its reach wide. But under her hands it became agile, every curve of terrain mirrored in her movements. Ahead, the ridgeline split into 2 valleys. The obvious corridor would take her toward the 4th target, but her instincts screamed that enemy sensors were concentrated there. Instead, she banked hard into the narrower pass, the bomber's wingtips nearly scraping the rock walls. Turbulence rattled through the fuselage, but she held steady, teeth clenched, until the instruments stabilized. A sharp tone pierced her headset. Radar lock. Her eyes darted across the displays. A missile battery on the plateau had caught her silhouette as she emerged from the canyon. In seconds, multiple launchers ignited, white trails streaking skyward. The bomber was no nimble fighter jet, but she refused to accept inevitability. She pushed the controls forward, diving just above treetop level, then rolled into a climb that tested the bomber's limits. G-forces pressed her into the seat, her vision tunneling, but she rode it out. Missiles streaked past, searching, correcting, but she fed them angles they couldn't calculate. The threat indicators still screamed, but her timing was flawless. She triggered a decoy release, streams of heat signatures scattering across the sky. The missile split, chasing false targets, colliding in mid-air. The explosion lit up the horizon, but Elara had already slipped beneath the smoke. Breathing hard but controlled, she focused on the target ahead, a supply depot camouflaged under a shallow plateau bristling with air defenses. She executed a shallow climb, aligned her payload, and fired. The weapon tore through the structure, igniting fuel reserves that detonated with a chain reaction. The blast rolled outward, flattening emplacements before they could respond. One more objective fell. 4 destroyed now. The interlinked chatter on enemy comms became louder, more chaotic. Coordinators barked for reinforcements. Radar operators screamed about phantoms they couldn't trace. She almost smiled at the irony. Her call sign had never felt more fitting. She turned the bomber east, climbing into clearer skies. Below her, flames marked the wreck of what had been a fortress. Above her, the stars faintly emerged against thinning clouds, guiding her course forward. Her hands returned to steady motion, calm against the turbulence still echoing in her chest. She had danced with death in that valley and forced the impossible aircraft through maneuvers no manual would ever endorse. For the first time, she knew the enemy was truly afraid because something they believed untouchable was falling apart, one strike at a time. 6 down, 3 to go. The hardest was still waiting, but the balance of the war had already begun to shift. And Elara Storm Kane pressed deeper, a solitary shadow rewriting the sky. The fire from the supply depot still burned behind her when Elara pushed the spirit of Solara into a wide turn. Ash and smoke billowed upward, staining the horizon in black scars. Through her canopy, the sky looked strangely calm, blue expanse above, chaos below. She didn't let herself linger on the destruction. Ahead were the most dangerous fortresses of the network, and she knew the enemy had finally grasped the threat. Her threat receiver pulsed with sharper tones now. Radar cones swept faster, shifting rhythm as operators adjusted in real time. This wasn't the sleepy vigilance she had slipped past earlier. This was alert panic. Search beams stabbing everywhere, trying to corner a shadow they still couldn't track. Elara eased the throttle and adjusted altitude, keeping the bomber inside the folds of the land. Her route narrowed as mountains gathered, cliffs rising like jagged walls. The landscape forced her closer to the ground than she preferred, but that confinement also kept her hidden. The 4th strike had gutted their logistics hub. Now, with 5 destroyed, the last 3 bases carried the heaviest firepower and coordination. They were meant to be unassailable, fortified beyond reason. Each sat inside layers of radar and surface-to-air defenses, all cross-linked to protect one another. Taking them head-on would be suicide. She needed deception. She reached across the console, activating her custom algorithm, one she had written during long hours of simulation. The program calculated false emission patterns, creating phantom echoes designed to bait radar operators into reacting to ghosts. With every adjustment, she tricked their systems into painting threats where none existed. She could almost picture the confusion in their command bunkers, alarms blaring, screens flashing, operators pointing at empty skies. The enemy's comms lit up in disarray. Some screamed about targets in the north, others swore intruders came from the south. Amid that chaos, she slid through the gap toward the 7th fortress. It sat on a coastal bluff, concrete buried deep, its missile tubes aimed out to sea. Knocking it out would break the chain shielding the shoreline and open a breach in the entire defense net. She steadied her bomber, armed the payload, and whispered the checklist under her breath. But as she aligned for release, new warnings filled her headset. Enemy fighters, fast interceptors, had scrambled. Dots flared across her display, streaking toward her from 2 different directions. Her stomach tightened. Solara wasn't designed to dogfight. Against jets she was slow and heavy, but she had stealth on her side. She pulled back gently, guiding the bomber into a shallow climb, then cut power slightly. To the interceptor's radar, she became a smear in the background clutter. They would overshoot if they didn't see her in time for seconds. That felt like hours. She listened to the roar of engines she couldn't see. Then they flashed beneath her, a blur of silver knives cutting the air. They swept past, their instruments fooled. Elara exhaled once. Relief could wait. She pitched Solara downward again, realigning her sight on the coastal base. The release cue blinked, and she pressed the trigger. A deep rumble shook through the aircraft as the precision munition dropped free. She veered instantly away, hugging the sea's edge. Behind her, the bunker erupted in a plume of orange flame, followed by secondary blasts as stored missiles cooked off. Waves battered the shoreline from the force. Fortress number 7 was gone. Her headset caught the rising panic on enemy channels, commands overlapping, frantic demands to locate the attacker. She banked away, pushing Solara inland again. 2 remained, and they were the strongest of all. The 8th fortress loomed in the center of the network, ringed by overlapping missile shields and defended by radar arrays that rotated in unison. It was the nerve core of the grid. Destroying it would unravel everything, but it was also the most heavily protected. Elara slowed, pulling Solara into a wide arc. Her algorithm pulsed, generating false emissions once again, but the operators had grown wary. Their sweeps grew tighter, more precise. She knew she couldn't simply rely on deception anymore. She needed to force them into error, so she devised something more dangerous: bait. She released a cluster of countermeasures at high altitude, programming them to mimic a large formation. To the radars, it looked like a squadron charging from the west. Every operator watching screens would be compelled to react. Seconds later, chatter exploded over comms as the enemy redirected batteries toward the decoys. That was her window. She pushed Solara low, skimming along the ridges. The base appeared ahead, half hidden by reinforced hills. She armed her payload and steadied her breathing. Timing was everything. Missiles fired wildly into the sky at her ghost formation, streaks of smoke cutting across empty air. She pressed her advantage, slicing through the gap. The release cue blinked. She dropped the weapon and immediately banked hard, skirting the edge of their coverage. The explosion arrived seconds later, a thunderous crack that shook her canopy. The central fortress folded inward, antennas snapping, bunkers collapsing. The command hub of the network was erased. Her cockpit trembled, not from the blast, but from the sudden change in electronic noise. The defense grid fractured. Without its coordinator, the remaining systems lost synchronization. Sweeps went out of phase, radars overlapped poorly, and the once seamless wall became patchwork. 8 fortresses gone, 1 remained. But as she turned toward the final target, alarms shrieked. The last base had anticipated this move, pulling all surviving resources to its defense. Radars focused, missile launchers raised, and the interceptors she had evaded earlier were returning. The entire network's remnants converged on a single point, determined to stop her at any cost. Her hands tightened on the controls. She had come this far, threading impossible corridors, destroying strongholds one after another. Now the last obstacle towered ahead, bristling with everything they had left. She whispered once more, steady and calm, the same words her grandfather had told her years ago in the desert night. Sometimes one mission changes history. The spirit of Solara angled into its final approach, a solitary shadow diving headfirst into a storm of fire. The final stronghold rose on her display like a wall of steel. Its defensive umbrella pulsed with overlapping circles, each layer bristling with weapons meant to obliterate anything that dared draw close. Every radar array in the network now pivoted toward her, like 1,000 eyes narrowing to catch a single shadow. Elara Storm Kane gripped the controls, steady but unyielding. This was the last strand holding the enemy net together. If she failed here, everything she had accomplished would collapse into nothing. The spirit of Solara thundered forward, its engines muted by stealth design yet vibrating through her bones. Warning tones filled her headset. The system readouts painted a picture she already understood. Missiles primed, batteries aligned, interceptors inbound. They were throwing everything into this last stand. For the first time, she felt the bomber itself resist her commands, not because it faltered, but because the demands she placed on it pressed against the very edge of its design. She eased the bomber lower, folding it into the terrain. Sharp ridges broke the horizon, jagged teeth clawing at her wings. Her eyes darted between instruments and the looming earth, calculations firing in her mind faster than the computers could update. She traced every contour like a pianist reading music, hearing the rhythm of the landscape beneath the roar. A flash across her canopy, missiles launched, white trails arced upward, a dozen, then more, clawing at the sky like spears. Her cockpit screamed with alarms. Elara silenced them with a single touch. She did not need machines to remind her she was seconds from death. Her instinct took over. She banked sharply, the bomber groaning under the maneuver. For an instant, the spirit of Solara seemed impossibly wide for the canyon. She forced it through, cliffs rushing past on either side. Heat washed across her canopy as missiles detonated against rock faces, fooled by her sudden dive. Shards of stone ricocheted against her wings, harmless but loud, like a storm of hammers beating metal. Her hands moved again, rolling the aircraft upward into open sky. More missiles tracked her, faster this time, adjusting angles with merciless efficiency. She toggled countermeasures, releasing bursts of heat decoys that scattered like falling stars. The incoming warheads split, some chasing false flares, others stubbornly locked onto her craft. Her pulse remained steady. She remembered nights in the desert, where silence taught her patience. She remembered her grandfather's words, "Stars never lie." She searched her canopy for the constellation she had marked earlier, aligning her instinct with the cosmos. With that marker, she yanked Solara into a hard climb, pulling nose and wing into a trajectory only her manual calculations could justify. The missiles overshot. Explosions lit the night sky like thunderclaps, throwing orange light across her canopy. But Solara lived, pressing forward, closer to the heart of the final fortress. On the ground below, the stronghold fired everything it had left. Guns erupting, radars sweeping, missile silos cracking open. It was a storm of fury, desperate and wild. To them, she must have seemed like a phantom that refused to break. Her targeting display locked onto the command bunker, the nexus of their defense. Without hesitation, she armed the final payload. But the system balked, guidance scrambled by the sheer density of jamming signals. The coordinates jittered, uncertain, as though the machine itself doubted her. She did not. Her hands flew across the panel, overriding automation, inputting manual adjustments. She recalculated trajectory by eye, by instinct, by memory of how the wind bent across ridges and how the earth curved beneath her. She didn't just see the map, she felt it. "Release," she whispered. The weapon dropped, disappearing into the storm below. She banked Solara hard, racing away from the sight. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the earth tore open. A column of fire surged skyward, brighter than the sun, followed by rolling shock waves that rattled her teeth even inside the cockpit. The command bunker collapsed into itself, concrete folding like paper, steel twisting in molten arcs. The last fortress was gone. The grid collapsed instantly. Radars flickered into static, missile systems fell silent, and the comms channels she monitored turned into chaos, officers shouting in disbelief, commands tripping over one another. The coordinated net of 9 had been severed, leaving only ruins scattered across the landscape. Elara allowed herself one breath, deep and grounding. Then she reached for her radio. "Control Spirit 1, mission complete. All targets neutralized." Silence answered her, stretching unbearably. Then a voice, halting, filled her headset. "Spirit 1, confirm, all 9. She steadied her tone. "Confirmed. 9 enemy bases destroyed. Network eliminated. Returning to base." Back at Fort Halcyon, the operations floor erupted in noise. Cheers, shouts, disbelief, screens lit with confirmation, feeds replaying her strikes, officers gripping each other as if to test the reality of what had been achieved. On the observation deck, General Mercer stood motionless, staring at the sky. His hand, always rigid, trembled slightly against the railing. For decades he had trusted only experience, dismissed innovation as a gamble too costly. But the proof now seared across the horizon was undeniable. One captain he had dismissed had just rewritten what their entire command thought impossible. His voice reached her again, gravel but softened, heavy with something approaching reverence. "Spirit 1, what you've done today will be studied for generations. You've turned every lesson we thought immutable upside down." Her reply was simple. "Sir, I just drew the line no one else would." As she turned Solara toward home, the adrenaline drained slowly, leaving a quiet clarity. She had faced every layer of resistance, the skepticism of her own command, the fury of an enemy fortress network, the limitations of a bomber not meant for improvisation, and she had endured. When she touched down hours later, the base stood waiting. Mechanics, officers, even soldiers who had doubted her lined the runway, watching in silence as Solara rolled to a stop. The canopy lifted, and Elara climbed out, helmet in hand, eyes fixed forward. The crowd did not cheer at first. They simply stared, as though unsure how to react to a reality they had never believed possible. Then a ripple of clapping began, spreading, swelling until the hangar roared with it. General Mercer stepped forward. His face betrayed the weight of pride and humility tangled together. He extended his hand, the gesture formal but filled with respect. "Major Storm Kane," he said, addressing her by the rank she had not yet been officially given, but everyone now knew she had earned. She took his hand firmly. No speech, no flourish. Just acknowledgement that the sky no longer belonged only to tradition. Weeks later, she would be offered command of a strategic unit, her tactics incorporated into training manuals that once dismissed such ideas as reckless. Cadets would learn about her improvisation, her use of deception, her reliance on celestial guidance when systems failed. They would be told that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat was the courage to see the world differently. But in that moment, standing on the tarmac, as the spirit of Solara cooled behind her, Elara allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not for the praise, not for the history books, but because she had proven something deeper, that survival, and even triumph, belonged to those willing to defy the line everyone else was too afraid to cross. The laughter that had once filled the war room was gone. In its place was silence, respect, and the knowledge that one pilot had redrawn the boundaries of possibility. And far beyond the base, in the ruins of 9 shattered fortresses, the enemy would remember the day the sky itself betrayed them. They said she would never make it, that she was too green, too untested, too reckless to even touch the flight deck of a B-2 Spirit. But the echoes of 9 burning enemy strongholds told another story. When Elara stepped down from the cockpit, boots crunching against the tarmac, there was no roar of applause waiting, just a silence so heavy it bent the air. Generals who had once dismissed her lowered their eyes. Crew chiefs froze mid-movement, and the same commanders who mocked her with sneers were left with nothing but the hollow weight of their own doubt. She had not just flown the mission. She had redefined what it meant to carry the weight of a nation alone. Her uniform still smelled of scorched metal, her gloves were stiff with sweat, her heartbeat had not yet slowed from the rhythm of battle. Yet her expression carried no triumph, only the stillness of someone who had seen the edge of what no one else dared. Some whispered her call sign in disbelief, others reached out as if touching her sleeve might anchor them back to reality. And across the base, soldiers young and old stood straighter, as if her flight had added steel to their spines. Because the truth was undeniable, 9 bases gone, every strike clean, every risk calculated, every decision hers alone. For Elara, it was not glory she sought, it was survival, it was proof, it was the unyielding belief that in the sky, skill spoke louder than hierarchy. She had carried more than bombs in her stealth wings that night. She carried every insult, every dismissal, every time her name had been laughed off the roster, and she dropped them, one by one, like payloads of fire upon the arrogance that held her back. History would remember her sortie not as an accident of strategy, but as a turning point, because from that day forward no one could ever again say, she isn't ready. And yet, she never raised her voice. She never demanded validation. She simply walked past the line of stunned faces, helmet tucked beneath her arm, eyes forward, silence louder than any speech. For in the silence lived a truth that no one could erase. She had done the impossible. 9 enemy fortresses reduced to ash, a single pilot at the helm of a bomber that demanded 2. The Spirit had always been known as a machine of shadows. That night, it became the voice of a woman who refused to break. The aftermath rippled far beyond the hangar walls. Across briefing rooms, her name replaced every cautionary tale about inexperience. Across flight academies, cadets whispered her mission like legend, tracing their fingers along maps as if following the very arcs she had flown. And within the enemy's own records, one detail stood unaltered: the night. Their strongest positions vanished beneath the wings of a single pilot. Elara never asked to be a symbol, but symbols are not chosen. They are forged by fire, by doubt, by the crushing weight of those who hope you fail, and she bore it all until it burned into something indestructible. Her story is more than a flight log. It is a warning to those who underestimate and a beacon to those who are underestimated. She proved that resolve is not measured in rank, that precision is not owned by years in uniform, that sometimes the one they laugh at in the briefing room is the same one they'll owe their lives to before dawn. And so, when the record keepers close the file and the analysts debate tactics, one fact will outlast the reports. They said she was too inexperienced to fly, but she destroyed 9 enemy bases alone. This is Silent Defenders. If her story shook you, let us know below. Would you have trusted her from the start, or would you have doubted like the rest? Hit that like button if you believe courage is not defined by titles. Subscribe if you believe silent defenders deserve to be remembered. And share this story so no one forgets what happened that night above the clouds. Because in the end, the world changes not by those who wait for permission, but by those who dare to fly when told they cannot.